Hi class, welcome back. This is probably going to be our last video lecture that I'll be uploading this semester. And yeah, crazy times. So this week has been really interesting in that I've had a lot of students who've just been asking me, Miss Lear, I feel really like overburdened by having to get through these online classes and transition. And a lot of students have been telling me how much they miss sort of like the organic conversations that we were having in class, and then also feeling sort of just disconnected, and that the amount of work that we have facing us here at the end of the semester, that it's also just sort of feels insurmountable. And so I've been telling them, well, what you should try doing is to make a list. And that way we can see what we have accomplished, what we have left to accomplish, and then just sort of the psychology of being able to cross something off the list. And so I have actually made a list poem. So this is what our quarantine poem of the day is. Things to try and do. 1. Re-explore sun rays. 2. Find shadow strands in fallen bits of hair. 3. Erase time, or at least the pain of it. 4. Take a long, deep breath in the arms of your neighbor who we forgot to hold before we forced retreat. 5. Plant a garden of beautiful foliates. 6. Feel the breeze of still air. 7. Explore the haunt. 8. Find rapture in the restless beating of the body isolated. 9. Apologize. It's been a long winter. 10. Call the lonely on the red revolutionary love letter telephone that blinks on and off in the night. 11. Plant a garden filled with fruits and full breast nourishing luster. 9. Pray for those who are prey. 13. Feel your body in the void of moments. 14. Call mother and thank her for her renewal, which is your renewal, which is our renewal, which is we were never broken. 15. Accept the myth of time. 16. Pull out the weeds that were long ignored. 17. Listen to the birds sing. 18. Listen to the trees sing. 19. Set reminder to record the holy fire burn through dawn's breaking. 20. Kiss at the moon. 21. Remember, you are still good, good in stillness. So I thought that might actually be an interesting free writing exercise that you could do for this week's in-class journal activity, right? To write a list poem. And that's something that I'm always like sort of bringing up for young poets. There's a really great prompt: write a list of 10 things I know to be true. So maybe that's what your list poem will be. A list of 10 things you know to be true. Or maybe your list poem is going to be more about, ways to survive quarantine. or ways to forget about quarantine, right? Just sort of allow yourself the freedom. We did automatic writing last week with J Sheets, and now we're going to try doing a list poetry. And now here we go. We begin our lecture on sound. So obviously, sound is important in poetry. And I think not necessarily poetic devices, but I think that largely sound, or the sound that the poem is supposed to occupy in space when we're reading our works out loud, is one that goes slightly like undeveloped or untalked about in intro courses. So we're going to actually look at ways that we can incorporate sound into our reading. So sound devices. Sound devices are literary elements used in prose and poetry to stress certain sounds and create musical effects. The writers make their texts vibrant, emotive, and pleasing with the use of these devices. Also, they create pointed and special effects in their writings that help the reader in understanding the literary piece at a deeper level. However, the writers intentionally stress some syllables to emphasize sound that appeals to the reader in a certain way. So we talked about scansion already when we talked about poetic form, right? And what syllable is getting the stress, and how does the stress of the syllable affect the read of the poem, and what type of pattern does that poem create. But we're going to look at even further in depth into how does the sound create sort of an atmosphere in the poem itself, right? This is from The Fire by Robin Blazer. We talked about this some with Jay last class, but I wanted to come back to it briefly, just with us as a class together, and revisit some of these moments that he has in the work. The sequence of energies may involve all kinds of things. Anger may open a window. A sound from another world may completely reshape the present moment. The destruction of a friendship may destroy a whole realm of language or the ability to use it. Each piece is, in effect, an extended metaphor. Another word is probably needed because in the serial poem, the effort is to hold both the correspondence and the focus that an image is, and the process of those things coming together, so that the light from a white linen tablecloth reflects on the face on one's companion, becomes light, fire, and white moth, which happens to be in the room, is also light in the dark around the table, and thus both the light and the element of light that destroys it. I ask you to remember that every metaphor involves at least 4 elements, which are a story, and the bringing them together is an activity, glowing energy, if stopped over, if entered. And so there's a lot of we talked about how with Jay, how there's like the embodiment, and how he's looking at the body or life or breath or the poem in a very sort of like mystical way, right? As like this sort of energy that is reverberating between poet and reader, or poet and poem and reader, and how it gets at something that we can't necessarily always place language to or thoroughly understand, right? And what I liked here in this passage is anger may open a window. A sound from another world may completely reshape the present moment. The destruction of a friendship may destroy a whole realm of language and our ability to use it. Each piece is in effect an extended metaphor. And so we're looking at how there's all these sorts of elements within the poem, and how that is going to shape our relationship to the poem itself, right? And he's even aware of sound here in this passage, very, very subtly, right? But he knows that the sound of the thing has influence on us. Um, that gets to a part of us that is deeper than what we realize. The test of poetry is the range of pleasure it affords as sight, sound, and intellection. The test of poetry is the range of pleasure it affords as sight, sound, and intellection. Something to consider. And then lastly, the body hears the world, and the power of the earth over the body, the city over the body, is in terms of rhythms, meters, phrasing picked up. The body's own rhythms compose those, or it would shake to pieces. The music of the spheres is quite real, but the sound of the earth must meet it. We talked about, right, how in iambic pentameter, what iambic pentameter is doing is actually mimicking the most common rhythm that we find in just conversation, right? That it's our most natural, in a sense, a very natural speaking pattern. And so the body hears the world, and the power of the earth over the body and the city over the body is in terms of rhythms, meters, phrasing picked up. And again, he's sort of getting at this, like the status that the that the poet has to enter in order to not get in the way of the poem, right? Um, but that what we're doing is we're picking up on this sort of, again, like energy is what we would probably go on to call it here, but the sound that the poem is trying to embody, right? How does it sound? And then how does that sound affect us? And it has to be familiar, right? Because if it's too outside of familiarity, then it's nothing. But if it's too familiar, we don't hear it anymore, right? Where if it becomes a cliche or a common sensation. And so because of that, we lose that sort of like authenticity and new connection to the work itself, right? And there's this sort of balance, and here he's getting at where it's this sort of balance or sound of the earth itself, and what we do is we pick up on that small sound that we're trying to create as we move forward. So we have to look at how is sound created, how is stress created, and what kind of impact does that have on the reader of poetry. First, we're going to look at consonants. The repetition of consonant sounds, more specifically, the repetition of the final consonant sounds of an accented syllables or important words. 'Twas later when the summer went than when the cricket came. And yet we knew that gentle clock meant naught but going home. Home went clock. So there's a play on consonant endings that Dickinson is doing here in this passage, right? Where the t and k, they're very harsh consonant sounds. They're distancing, right? Whereas came and home, it's that ma, right? And it's more melodic, that it's less harsh to the reader as we move through it. 'Twas later when the summer went and when the cricket came. But we even have that cricket, right? That cricket. And it's interesting that we get that comfort right after we get that last sort of jarring sound from cricket. And then we get the same thing with clock. They're very similar sorts of sound. meant not, but going home. Alliteration. And this is one that we've been talking about a lot. And it's one that I find that I use a lot in my poetry personally, right? But alliteration is the repetition of identical consonant sounds that begin syllables in close patterns. So our example is while pensive poets painful vigils keep, right? While pensive poets painful vigils keep. That p p p p sound. That's alliteration. The repetition of the S sound, that's sibilance. Seven snakes slither, soundless, surrounded by seas. Oh, right there. I just made that up. But see, that's seven. And then it's something different when we have the repetition of vowel sound. You'll never put a better bit of butter on your knife. Better bit of butter on your knife, right? Good men are gruff and grumpy, cranky, crabbed, and cross. So we're getting a lot of that like repetition of sound in the second one. Gruff, grumpy, cranky, crabbed, and cross. Right? So it's just what it does is it awakens the reader, I would argue, right, when we stumble upon alliteration in a poem. Because it's, and I always describe it as the essence of rhyme without the rhyme. Rhyme for me is very difficult to do and not make it cliche and almost predictable. It's funny that as a kid, I used to. This is like what a nerd I am. But I used to like to anticipate what the rhyme was going to be when I would listen to songs. And so I could almost sound like I knew the song before I had ever even heard it because I was able to guess what the rhyme was going to be. And so for me, rhyme isn't something that I really like in poetry. I like it when modern poets can use rhyme and I don't even realize that the rhyme is there. Um, it's just harder for me to see done successfully and not be a little cliche, right? To use a harsh term. But just not predictable. And so that's one of the reasons I think I really love alliteration is it because it gives us that sense, that play with language that we get from rhyme, but it's not as over, well, it's used quite a bit now, but for me it still wakes me up when I hear that repetition of like sound. It also is a memory. It's a method of establishing memory, right? Is to use the sound as a way of helping learn or be able to recite poetry from memory. That's something that, you get to do in grad school. Fun, right? Yeah. Sibilance, that's the repetition of the S. And then assonance, this is the repetition of the vowel. It beats as it sweeps, as it cleans, right? Beats, sweeps, that it's the repetition of the vowel. Those images that yet fresh images beget, that dolphin torn, that gong tormented sea. And then something that I want us to do as a class, and we're reading this very famous poem by Sylvia Plath titled Daddy. And I want us to listen to how Plath, maybe. Why does this never work when I need it to? And so now I want us to listen to the poem Daddy by Sylvia Plath and just hear how she's using sound in the reading of the poem, right? She's emphasizing these sorts of unique displays of sound and what that does to the poem as we listen to it.
Daddy. You do not do any more black shoe in which I have lived like a foot for 30 years, poor and white, barely daring to breathe or hachoo. Daddy, I have had to kill you. You died before I had time, marble heavy, a bag full of God, ghastly statue with one gray toe big as a Frisco seal, and a head in the freakish Atlantic where it pours bean green over blue in the waters off beautiful Nauset. I used to pray to recover you, ach du, in the German tongue in the Polish town, scraped flat by the roller of wars, wars, wars. But the name of the town is common. My Polack friend says there are a dozen or two. So I never could tell where you put your foot, your root. I never could talk to you. The tongue stuck in my jaw. It's stuck in a barbed wire snare. Ich, 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 ich. I could hardly speak. I thought every German was you. And the language obscene, an engine, chuffing me off like a Jew to Dachau, Auschwitz, Belsen. I began to talk like a Jew. I think I may well be a Jew. The snows of the Tyrol, the clear beer of Vienna are not very pure or true. With my gypsy ancestress and my weird luck and my Tarok pack, I may be a bit of a Jew. I have always been scared of you, with your Luftwaffe, your gobbledygoo, and your neat moustache, and your Aryan eye, bright blue. Panzerman, oh you, not God but a swastika, so black no sky could squeak through. Every woman adores a fascist, the boot in the face, the brute heart of a brute like you. You stand at the blackboard, Daddy, in the picture I have of you, a cleft in your chin instead of your foot. But no less a devil for that, no, not any less the black man who bit my pretty red heart in two. I was 10 when they buried you. At 20 I tried to die and get back to you. I thought even the bones would do. But they pulled me out of the sack and they stuck me together with glue. And then I knew what to do. I made a model of you, a man in black with a Mein Kampf look and a love of the rack and the screw, and I said, I do. So, Daddy, I'm finally through. The black telephone's off at the root, the voices just can't worm through. If I've killed one man, I've killed two. The vampire who said he was you and drank my blood for a year, 7 years if you want to know. Daddy, you can lie back now. There's a stake in your fat black heart, and the villagers never liked you. They are dancing and stamping on you. They always knew it was you. Daddy, you bastard, I'm through.
Good. So now let's just look at this passage from Plath's work, right? You do not do any more black shoe. Ooh, ooh. And she's even using these like ooh sounds, and this use of German, right, throughout it. Achu, that's onomatopoeia, a word that sounds like a word that is spelled like a word as it sounds, right? Achu, Tarok, pack. And she's reliant on this long vowel, the ooh sound throughout the poem. And it creates that pacing, right? And the way that she's reading it, you feel it so strongly because it reoccurs constantly throughout ooh, 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 barely daring to breathe or achu. And then that harsh sort of Germanic. And what she's trying to do is she's sort of, in a sense, this poem is her shedding her love and admiration for her father who died when she was very young. There's a lot of different sorts of like image play and metaphor going on in the poem itself, right? But that ooh, oh, the sound, and even the sound that she reads the poem in. For me, the poem is meant more to be read, to take up space, than maybe as opposed to it being only written down, right? But we see too how sound is incredibly important for this work because there's so many sorts of disconnected metaphor and images. Like at one point, there's a vampire. There's the Nazi images that are happening, and so we have all of these very sorts of disconnected. Um, and almost difficult to follow trains of thought or connection. But how is she doing it? She's connecting each train through sound, right? We come back to that sound over and over and over again. Um, Plath is a very interesting poet in that she still is like challenging our reading today, even though there is a bit of sort of, there's some problem in this poem, obviously, but, interesting use. But, interesting. Wait, one, two. But, interesting use of sound. Cacophony, discordant sounds, and the jarring juxtaposition of harsh letters or syllables, sometimes inadvertent but often deliberately used in poetry for effects, as the opening line of Fences, crawling, sprawling, breaching spokes of stone. Crawling, sprawling, breaching spokes of stone. Right? Um, and so they're harsh tonally. That's one of the biggest things that we're looking for. And how are these harsh sounds influencing our read of the work itself? Euphony is harmonious sound, right? Harmony or beauty of that sound that provides a pleasing effect to the ear. Usually sought for in poetry for effect. It is achieved not only by the selection of individual word sounds, but also by the relationship in the repetition, proximity, and flow of sound patterns. Right? So this is harmonious, beautiful, melodic. And it's interesting that the definition contains that it's not only by the words, the individual word, because you can argue that about anything, right? That it's not only the individual word, that it's also the connection that it shares to other words in the line or the verse. Okay. Dissonance, a mingling or union of harsh, inharmonious sounds that are grating to the ear. I think that we see a lot of dissonance being used in the Plath poem, right? I did not dare to breathe, or achoo, choo, choo. The use of my Tarok pack, that there's the repetition there of that line. It's interesting, right? And that it definitely it jars you out of it, right? Which leads to that sort of the discomfort that we feel from the vampire witch metaphor as we start to get into this like dark mysticism in the poem. Well, she's showing us that transition in language as well. Onomatopoeia, right? We already talked about this a little bit, but it's the use of words such as hiss or murmur that imitate the sounds associated with the objects or actions they refer to. Murmur is such a beautiful word, right? Such a beautiful word, murmur. That it embodies the sound of the word that it's representing. Boom. That's another one, right? That's another example of onomatopoeia. And now we're going to look at rhyme, right? Some of you are very interested in finding ways to incorporate rhyme in a sort of new relationship to it. So we're going to look at types of rhyme. So rhyme is of two or more words, thus corresponding in sound. Pardon me, I'm drinking my coffee still. Right? Look, Mr. Wonderful, that's me. There you go. Look, Mr. Wonderful, that's me. Almost done with it. One of two or more words, thus corresponding in sound. Okay, so we're going to talk about Kubla Khan by Coleridge. And Jay brought Coleridge up in our discussion of automatic writing last week. The title of this is Kubla Khan, or A Vision in a Dream, a Fragment. And Coleridge is sort of famous for saying that while he was in the middle of writing this very long sort of epic poem, he was interrupted while writing it. And so that interruption forced him to forget the last, for most of the poem. But I want us just to look at elements of sound that are in this work.
Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree, where Alph the sacred river ran through caverns measureless to man down to a sunless sea. So twice 5 miles of fertile ground with walls and towers were girdled round, and there were gardens bright with sinuous riles, where blossomed many an incense-bearing tree, and here were forests ancient as the hills, enfolding sunny spots of greenery. But oh, that deep romantic chasm which slanted down the green hill athwart the cedarn cover, a savage place, as holy and enchanted as e'er beneath a waning moon was haunted by woman wailing for her demon lover. And from this chasm with ceaseless turmoil seething, as if this earth in fast thick pants were breathing, a mighty fountain momently was forced, amid whose swift half-intermitted burst huge fragments vaulted like rebounding hail, or chaffy grain beneath the thresher's flail. And mid these dancing rocks at once and ever it flung up momently the sacred river, 5 miles meandering with a mazy motion. Through wood and dale the sacred river ran, then reached the caverns, measureless to man, and sank in tumult to a lifeless ocean. And midst this tumult Kubla heard from far ancestral voices prophesying war. The shadow of the dome of pleasure floated midway on the waves, where was heard the mingled measure from the fountain and the caves. It was a miracle of rare device, a sunny pleasure dome with caves of ice. A damsel with a dulcimer in a vision once I saw. It was an Abyssinian maid, and on her dulcimer she played, singing of Mount Abora. Could I revive within me her symphony and song? To such a deep delight 'twould win me, that with music loud and long I would build that dome in air, that sunny dome, those caves of ice. And all who heard should see them there, and all should cry, beware, beware, his flashing eyes, his floating hair. Weave a circle round him thrice, and close your eyes with holy dread, for he on honey dew hath fed and drunk the milk of paradise.
And so why I chose this this poem to look at sound is just also that we can look and see just how that sort of mixture of sounds creates this sort of dreamy, sort of um, hot, we could even say. There's very like sensual sort of presence that this poem has. And then its use of harsh sounds to sort of wake us up out of that dream state. So it's just I mean, in this, it'd be a great poem for you to do your research project on as well. We do see that he is using rhyme through this work, right? So in Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree, where Alpha, the sacred river, ran through caverns measureless to man, down to the sunless sea. So twice 5 miles of fertile ground, with walls and towers were girdled round. And there were gardens bright with sinuous rills, where blossomed May an incense-bearing tree. And here where forests ancient as the hills, enfolding sunny spots of greenery. And this is also a good example too of how we can use rhyme, but we use rhyme in a way that is patterned but less predictable, right? And I think that that's another great example that we can see in this poem is the use of language and rhyme that's not commonplace. That's not commonplace. This is Lyrical Ballads, a passage, preface to Lyrical Ballads by William Wordsworth, where what he's doing is he's sort of outlining what it is that he's looking for romantic poetry to achieve. He begins, the principal object then proposed in these poems was to choose incidents and situations from common life and to relate or describe them throughout as far as was possible in a selection of language really used by men, and at the same time to throw over them a certain coloring of imagination whereby ordinary things should be presented to the mind in an unusual aspect, and further and above all, to make these incidents and situations interesting by tracing in them truly throughout ostentatiously the primary laws of our nature, chiefly as far as regards the manner in which we associate ideas in a state of excitement. Humble and rustic life was generally chosen because, in this condition, the essential passions of the heart find a better soil in which they can attain their maturity, are less under restraint, and speak a plainer and more emphatic language. Oh, and there's a typo there. My bad. So the principal object then is proposed that in these poems was the choice of incidents and situations from common life. This is a big shift that we see in poetry. And we talked about that when we got to Walt Whitman earlier on in the class, and how he's answering that sort of call um, that that Emerson is making for what the voice of the American poet should be. And it's very similar to what we're seeing here in Wordsworth's Lyrical Ballads, right? Where in romantic poetry, we make a shift away from works that are usually about higher um, so they're usually about higher members of society, right, of a higher class. The language is inapproachable. And again, we're very fixated on form and pattern, right? How can you prove that you're a good poet? Well, look at how good I am at writing this sonnet, and look at how exact I can make the language fit within this sort of structured pattern. Well, in a way, that then we could argue uh, ruins the naturalness of the sensation, because we're making the form the priority over the work itself. And so, what Wordsworth is arguing here is that we're no longer going to adhere to that sort of um, to that like sort of aesthetic. Instead, we're beginning to approach the truth or the naturalness of the emotion first before form. The language too of these men has been adopted, purified indeed from what appeared to be its real defects, from all lasting and rational causes of dislike and disgust, because such men hourly communicate with the best object from which the best part of language is originally derived, and because from their rank in society and the sameness in the narrow circle of their intercourse, being less under the influence of social vanity, they convey their feelings and notions in a simple and unelaborated expressions. So we're arguing here that we're using common speech because there isn't that sort of hot body or pride that's behind it. Instead, it's just true and natural. Um, and it's not limiting itself by the feeling of needing to sound or to be exact or something other than itself. I've wished to keep the reader in the company of flesh and blood, persuaded that by so doing I shall interest him. Others who pursue a different track will interest him likewise. I do not interfere with their claim, but wish to prefer a claim of my own. There will also be found in these volumes little of what is usually called poetic diction. As much pains has been taken to avoid it as is ordinarily taken to produce it. This has been done for the reason already alleged, to bring my language near to the language of men, and further because the pleasure which I have proposed to myself to impart is of a kind very different from that which is supposed by many persons to be the proper object of poetry. We're not writing epics, right? Or of gods or of kings. Instead, we're writing of common man, about common man, in the language of common man. Because maybe it's that language that allows us to be more true or more real or to understand it better from ourselves. It's a huge shift in poetry at this point, right? Where, and this is something that's in romantic poetry, right? That we're wanting to get to the real of the thing. We're still sort of trusting that emotional fancy, a sort of ethereal spiritual understanding of it as well, right? Where we're looking to see and to understand ourselves in the time of which we're writing. Think about Emerson when he argues that all language is archaic poetry. Well, that's because language is evolving and it reflects the time. And when we look at how we use these different like sorts of poetic elements in our work, we also have to look at it, is it reflectant of the time of which that the author is writing, and does language change over time? Yeah, that's how we have archaic words, because they're no longer used in common in language. Oh, skip ahead. So now let's look at rhyme, right? First, we're going to look at true rhyme. This is one that we're all very familiar with. It's words containing identical final syllables, right? So way and gray, say bouquet, fiance. those all are perfect, true rhyme, right? Blue, shoe, ado, who, few, I can't come up with any more on the spot, right? But so this is rhymes that we're familiar with, right? And it's can be patterned, right? But if we introduce rhyme or perfect rhyme, true rhyme in a way that isn't as predictable, it can be really powerful, right? I think about all the time. I'm back to that Wallace Stevens poem. I've read that poem hundreds of times, and it comes back to me all the time in my thinking and in my teaching. Right? I placed a jar in Tennessee, and round it was upon a hill. It made the slovenly wilderness surround that hill. The wilderness rose up to it and sprawled around, no longer wild. The jar was round upon the ground, and tall and in a port and tall and of a port in air. It took dominion everywhere. The jar was gray and bare. It did not give a bird or bush like nothing else in Tennessee, right? Well, I had been teaching that poem for a while before I even recognized that all of a sudden the language begins to become patterned and rhymed, right? Because it was such an interesting use of rhyme that it felt natural and yet unpredictable. And so I had to read it several times before I even started to pick up on that presence of rhyme in the poem. And so that's when we can look at rhyme as effective. I also like when I see students use almost like reinvent words to create rhyme and sense of rhyme. And I think that would be something that would be very interesting to use in sound poetry. I rhyme. They're words that look like they should rhyme, but they don't, right? Uh, we have bow and cough. Uh, through enough, right? That they look like they should rhyme. Love and move. Um, that words that appear like they should rhyme, but they don't, right? And so it's something to think about too, that if we can use words that would appear to rhyme or look like they would rhyme on the page, that changes the meaning or relationship that we have to that language when we read it out loud, right? Um, or when we come to know the word, that there's the appearance of familiarity, but then oh, that familiarity is lost once we know what the word means or what the word sounds like. Slant rhyme. This is where it's like almost rhyme, right? That's how I like to think of it. Words that almost rhyme but don't exactly. So you have noon and sun. There's that feeling of rhyme, but it doesn't quite rhyme. Unpack, detach, packed, slicked, slick, packed, slicked, right? We're getting close to that rhyme, to that feeling of that familiarity or musicality. Rhyme has a musicality to it, right? A sense of peace and sound and melody. And we can trick our reader into thinking that they did perceive a rhyme almost. Double rhyme, rhymes using words of 2 syllables or more. This is often referred to as a feminine rhyme. So season, reasons, habit, rabbit, that there's the double rhyme inside the word. This is known as a masculine rhyme, right? Occurs when the rhyme is on the final syllable of the 2 rhyming words. In 1 syllable words, masculine rhyme is easy to identify: blow, flow, book, cook, confess, redress. And then we get the triple rhyme, right? Trip rhyme. Rhymes using words of 3 or more syllables in which the heavy stress falls on any syllable other than the last, also called the dactyl rhyme. Dactyl. Macavity, gravity, warily, merrily. Internal rhyme occurs in the middle of the line, right? So we have rhymes. I set my hat on the mat, right? That it's not divided by two lines. It's not the ending rhyme, right? That makes up that sort of heroic line, couplet, right? I was a fool who skipped school. Oh, you can look at that if you'd like. Resonance, we can look at that if you like. And so now let's get into sound poetry a little bit. And I was actually pretty pleasantly surprised that even though we weren't in class and we haven't actually covered these poems yet, I saw several papers that wrote on some of our sound poets, and it was really interesting. The first one, sound poetry, is an artistic form bridging literary and musical composition in which the phonetic aspects of human speech or foreground instead of a more conventional semantic, and syntactic values, verse without words. By definition, sound poetry is intending primarily for performance. Um, a good example of this is Gwendolyn Brooks' We Real Cool. We're going to read A Sunset of the City next week together. But in We Real Cool, Brooks is actually using, there's a very, we could argue it's one of the earlier forms of spoken word poetry. But she's using sound in a way that helps reinforce memory with this poem. And there's very sort of pattern, a very specific pattern by which she reads this poem. And it's the emphasis on the we. We real cool. We left school. We lurk late. We strike straight. We sing sin. We thin gin. We jazz June. We die soon. Where there's a sense of musicality. Jazz is also a heavy influence in the way that the poem is reading. And yeah, it's just a fun poem if you ever wanted to do a close explication on the multiple meanings that we can gather from this poem. But we're not going to do that now because we've been recording for a long time. How long have I been recording? Okay, I'm going to try and wrap this up. So now I want us to look at Tracy Morris. Her work is very reliant on sound and the presence that sound gives to the poem itself. And so this is actually a recording that was on display at the MoMA of Morris's sort of videography and the reading of the work itself and the representation that the work has.
Life when we were kids was like playing giant steps. We were told to advance. We obeyed, took a chance. Go, speed racer, go, speed racer, go, speed racer, go. Go, speed racer. Imploring breaths heave. Just a taste of it should not be hot. It's fall. After all, school began. Man could have ran to the store and been back twice over. Finally let you buy me a cherry soda. How we got to your house, I did not recall. Delicious treats, thoughts of sweets and all. Felt the need for a straw hat as we fall on those sheets to cover the heat in my face, this sun. Tongue around little hairs along neck, then chest, but fully dressed. Burgundy his brown face, more red in my case. Waist full lace of my slip, my depleted skirt, your unbuttoned shirt. Both unnerved, driven to give in. Pleasure of your lips, your hips, pressure is more than gravity. Peace, entreaties, subversives are wool, rayon, cotton, and nylon. Curse words, their intervention hated in those seconds. Moments later, surprised, I'm relieved. That last bit of friction sure let off steam. At last succeeded. I said, go ahead. And you said, okay. Heart hoped I'd stay. It couldn't hear the excitement and fear battling between your ears. Hands finally slip by sides, leave behind indelible impressions. What remains undone. Left alone to collect, I phoned and said, coming home, Ma. Stop by my friends. You went to relieve yourself. Stick of gum helped cool me out. About to go, you returned, slowly tried to play it off, flicked on the game and said, whatever. That now or never look erased. Then pulled my braids, feigned play at kid game spade. You whispered, I can wait. Life when we were kids was like playing giant steps. We were told to advance. We obeyed, took a chance. You're it. Play your life like chess. Capture one piece at a time. Forward east, castle next. Not the pace, but the steps. Checkmate. Poetry Spots is presented with the support of the New York.
And I really like the "You Startin' With Me" poem because of how there's just so many really beautiful elements going on in the poem that Morris is playing with. First off, I love the idea of the idea of innocence and sexuality that's happening between our two characters, right? They're adolescent, they're kids, and so we're sort of like being invited into this like adventure forward into adulthood that then, and it's really beautiful too, the female speaker says, "No, I'm not ready," and that is respected, right? And that's just also an image that I feel like is really important to see, specifically for women of color, to be able to say, "No, stop," and then that be respected, and not taken advantage of, which is cool. But how she's using sound in this poem, right? The "Go speed racer, go speed racer, go speed racer, go." Um, Shoulda let you buy me a cherry soda. All of that is being used to add like like these layers of multiple layers of meaning, right? That there's that innocence of the play that they're going through. That's why it's a children's song that's being used. That's why it's, you know, cherry soda that's being purchased, not a drink. And then also that's kind of what we're doing at that age, right? That the element of adolescence that we're always racing towards adulthood. Um, and it's that like race that we can sort of get lost up in. Just a really cool poem. And I encourage you to go check out more of Morris's work. And lastly, we're going to look at language poetry. So just how far can this sort of sound become emphasized, and how can sound affect the reading of a poem? Well, it can be stretched as far as we can get within the medium, right? And so language poetry is avant-garde, almost Dadaist poetry. Um, and language poetry is chased the art form back to its source. In this case, words more often than sounds or letters. The idea was that language should dictate meaning rather than the other way around, where sound dictates meaning or presence dictates meaning. Um, Oh, it got very dark in here all of a sudden. I think the sun is setting. The language poets broke sentences into disjointed phrases and broke phrases into words in order to cleanse language of corruption and banality. And so I wanted to play um, an example of a poet, a modern poet who I would argue is a language poet, named Billy Cancel. And so I'm going to play just a clip of Cancel reading. I know that some of you read Cancel because that's still what's on our class calendar for this week. And yeah, I know some of you are hating me right now. But so now that we've like looked briefly at what language poetry is, we've looked at what sound does and how sound influences a poem. Now I want you to look at Cancel. And really, he does for
Celestial navigation for weirdos. Celestial navigation for weirdos. Yes, yes, integrates limited palette and don't have much time. Suitable to spare backdrop. If you see a spoon in a cup, don't make a joke. Whitewash a brilliant disregard. Absolute lack of community attachment. Incidentally, this is the point conventional Gothic trots in, like a 1,000 horse charge, and it won't be worth a single radish. Copy flow break, then flip the Peter. It'll be all there in turquoise, purple, deep lilac. If you see sharks by day, play your radio all night. And nothing if not consistent. Dreamt of a grey-pink cloth-patched hill beneath a blue gauze sky and a single red spot where the nerve was damaged. If you would like an update on the status of your application at any time, please email ironhorse@alienlandscape.gov. My experience today with Facebook was very disappointing.
Yeah, so I just encourage you if those of you want to do it sort of like mimic the style of cancel. I came up with this idea because I think it's something that we have been given an opportunity to do would be to create audio files of you reading your work to me too, if you want for your final project. Whatever we want to do. I think that this class has really attempted to show you just how limitless poetry can be, where we began and then where we are now. And yeah, you're the only thing that holds the poet back is the poet themselves. So good luck. I'm very excited to see our final projects. And yeah, I don't have very many conference times scheduled, and that scares me a little. But maybe that's just because that's how sort of ahead you are and well prepared you are for your final paper. Um, if you would like to schedule a conference, remember there is in week 5, I created a sign up for individual telephone conferences with me. So I'm looking forward to hearing from you, and I'm looking forward to seeing you, and I'm really looking forward to see where this class and this semester has brought us. Happy writing.